I was listening to we had one of our guests was Jonathan Roth. He's professor of Jewish studies in San Jose, California. And we were talking about the Roman army and the different groups that were part of the Roman army. And I was telling him that I find ludicrous they say that Jesus, instead of being a peacemaker or a pacifist, that he was a revolutionary. And if he was a revolutionary, he was the worst revolutionary that you ever heard of.
Yeah, what's that?
He would have gotten beat up by Che Guevara and Castro
right,
and all those guys.
Right.
Because he had no weapons, he had no army, he had no plan. The way that is depicted in the Gospels, he was roaming around with no resources, with a group of ragtag people that had no skills. They say there was that one guy who was a zealot, so he carried a knife with him or was ready to fight. And then there was a couple of people that maybe they said somebody picked up some weapons and he told them keep them just in case. And then Peter cut the guy's ear. So this idea that some revolutionaries in Latin America, or even some people now in some of the movements that are rising at this time because of all the bad things that are going on, that they would try to quote him as someone who would use force to take down an oppressive system, it seems unacceptable and undefensible. But Jonathan Roth actually said that there's no evidence either way. So this is a guy who's an expert, and he's read all the sources, and he knows about Jewish history of that time and what was going on during the Second Temple period. And his opinion said that you can go either way.
Interesting.
And the reason that I would give him that is because there was a scholar about 60 years ago, Eisenberg, I believe was his name, who wrote a whole book about how Jesus was a revolutionary. And he found sources to connect him in those ways. So I think that would be a minority position. It's a creative interpretation of what could he have done. So that's the problem, is that you can have someone who would say, Jesus was rich. And you would say, well, how do you support that? And he's like, well, it says that he had a bunch of women who supported his ministry. So we'll let him walk around in robes, like messed up clothes. Maybe they gave him a nice cloak, and maybe they fed him or whatever. So he has supporters, and what they try to do is they try to impose their own experience onto him. And you see that in Islam, where people see themselves identified with Muhammad. So now Muhammad somehow supports whatever they're doing. So that's the challenge, is that we weren't there, and all we have is writings and maybe a couple of corroborating other sources. So if people say, well, American Buddhism is not like ancient Buddhism, because we know that the Buddha was a prince and he gave everything up to go become a monk and become one with nirvana. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that every person that follows his teachings should do the same? Or, since it's only a philosophy to a lot of people, can you incorporate these ideas without having to leave everything behind and become a secluded person? Well, to me, that's inconsistent, because the same would go for Jesus. If Jesus was truly a poor man and he rode a donkey, how can you now claim that it's okay to be full of, the Pope has a throne and he has all these servants and stuff like that? How can you justify that and say, well, it's a different time period? He brought in the kingdom, and now the kingdom is realized. And I guess people could say that about Buddhism. The Buddha sacrificed his life and set the example, and not everybody can achieve it. So we do what we can with what we have. So everybody's going to come up with their way to incorporate it into their own lives. And a lot of people can say that I'm being judgy, that like, who am I to say what's the right way or the wrong way to follow their own religion? But if you go to the original sources, and there's absolutely nothing about, and this is the biggest problem. Jesus said, do not hoard money because you cannot take it with you when you die. How is it that all you see talked about by these mega churches is that it's all about the dough? Like, it just makes no sense.
What is the origin of that? I don't remember if we covered that. Do you think there was a defining moment where someone was like, oh, we can start bringing money into this conversation? Have you charted the history of that?
Well, it's just, it goes back to the medieval times where, it's really easy to dupe people, and that's the problem. So, you would go into a small town and you already brought everybody to the faith. So they know the basic principles, and you say, listen, we're going to build this cathedral and we need everybody to pitch in. And they're like, well, we barely have enough to eat. And they're like, doesn't God deserve the best? Do you really want us to create a temple to God that doesn't have the best jewels and ornaments and stuff like that? And they would convince people to do that. But you see that with anybody. You would say, well, why is Tony Robbins so rich? Why doesn't he just give away his message? Well, he has the right to obtain a benefit from his wisdom, and you have to pay $2,000 to go to his conference. Why not? Every other person who is knowledgeable of any subject charges for their services. So then, so you apply the same rules for the secular world to the religious world, and then you end up in the same place.
Interesting. Yeah, what you made me think of when you said that it probably started in the medieval era was that also I feel like, and I know you've talked about this topic on your show, that a lot of the anti-Semitic tropes and things about money lending sort of came around then. I don't know the exact history, but what's interesting is that in some ways, it's like there's a charlatanism of money going on in Christianity too that's not being addressed here. Like, I don't know if there was like those things came in tandem. There was like an anti-Jewish thing and a Christians asking for money for their cause, and those sort of like, I just think it's interesting. I don't know what the relationship is or if there is any.
Well, it would be interesting to figure out if your priest told you cannot go to heaven unless you give indulgences, unless you bribe the priest so he can get you a place in heaven, that you would have to go ask a Jew for money because none of your Christian friends would lend you any money, because it was a sin for Christians to charge interest on money borrowed.
Interesting.
So since Jews weren't part of the kingdom, they could do that, but then you would blame the Jews for being greedy for doing it.
Right. Do you who do you think? My grandfather, I had a really great conversation with him when he was alive. He was a American historian and ancient biblical historian as well, an archaeologist. He collected things from all religions. And one time I asked him, as I was getting more into my atheist phase, this was like 16, 17, I say, Grandpa, do you think there's a God? And his defense that God existed was that he thought, at least he said, that he couldn't figure out a reason. He couldn't figure out an explanation for the Torah beyond something mystical. Now, he definitely had conversations with other scholars and researchers that believed it could have been a group of men that wrote it or one man that wrote it, all that kind of thing. I'm curious, in your opinion, based on all your research and who you've talked to, who do you think wrote the Old Testament? Where have you landed on that?
I'm going to throw a curveball at
you. Okay.
So, do you know much about Freud?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a scholar by any means, but...
So Freud was born Jewish, but I don't know what happened when he was a kid. I think he was adopted by a Catholic family.
Right.
And he was raised Catholic, but he knew he had Jewish ancestry. And so one day he invited this guy who was a Jewish scholar to his house, and he had a copy of the Zohar. And they couldn't believe it because this guy had been trashing God and the idea of God through all his writings. And Freud really loved Greek mythology, and he felt that every trauma or every psychological issue was connected to the mythological stories. So Jews already felt that he was kind of like a he was the Spinoza of the 1900s.
Hmm.
He was a controversial guy
Right, of
who
course.
had a Jewish connection, but they didn't know where it was coming. So then he's like, hey, I have a manuscript for my new book. And the guy is like, okay. Well, first of all, why do you have a copy of the Zohar? And he's like, I like all kinds of mythology, Jewish mythology, Greek mythology, whatever. And the Zohar is a very complicated book, and we can talk about that some other time. But so that was surprising. So then he gives him the manuscript, and he's like, check it out. So the guy reads like the first page, and he throws it on the ground and takes off. And Freud's like, what happened? What's the problem? So the book that Freud had written was called Moses and Monotheism, I believe.
Hmm.
And in that book, he describes that Moses was a hero of the Hebrews that either took them out of Egypt or led them to the Holy Land. And once he did what he was supposed to, the people rebelled and killed him. And that they built Judaism on this fear of a father figure. And how they were regretting or grieving their sin of murdering him.
Interesting.
So the Jewish guy was so angry because he's like, how dare you? We've been blamed for killing Jesus, the God of the Christians, through the centuries, and now we are at fault for killing God himself. How can you do that? So that's what's ridiculous is that if you take this super skeptical perspective and you deny that there's anything supernatural about any book, but let's be specific about Judeo monotheism, then you can come up with all kinds of different theories. And the biggest issue with atheists with the Torah is that the way that God is portrayed to them, and I really don't understand how can they say this, is that he sounds like a 3-year-old.
Right.
So they say, well, go and fight the Canaanites and slaughter them, or, don't take prisoners or whatever. Oh, he's so temperamental. How can anybody follow a temperamental God? And it's like the only way you can follow a temperamental God is because he can relate to you. If you feel that God is this amorphous source of energy or whatever that has no relation to humanity, that is completely devoid of emotion, then you have no way to experience it. But then the issue, and this is where we get into religious philosophy, is that God is being imagined in our own terms. So instead of us being made in the image of God, he's being made into our image.
Right.
So if God is a grumpy old man that every time that we disappoint him, he strikes us or he scolds us or something like that, that's where Freud got his idea. The problem is that God is also beneficent. Nobody would follow the idea of God if God was all wrath and all destruction. But in Judaism, you have the idea that both good and bad come from God. And for Christians, that's very difficult to chew on because they have a system that you have the devil who has almost like the same amount of power as God does. And it's like a Dungeons and Dragons battle.
Right.
And in Judaism, the devil or Satan is more of a dog in a leash that he unleashes whenever he wants to, and then he brings back in. So if you say that the Torah is supernatural, there's very simplistic ideas. Like you hear different rabbis say, well, there was it 6 million people that saw it? They saw the revelation of Sinai. And they say no other religion has that many witnesses. And it's like, yeah, but we only have one account. So
yeah.
So how can you verify that there was 6 million people there? You have to believe that what the guy said, that there was 6 million people. And then what makes it supernatural is that it has ideas that are foreign to that era. And then you talk to an archaeologist and they say, no, it doesn't. People worship in a similar manner in Canaan or the Hittites. People worship in a similar manner with the Egyptians or the Babylonians. So what makes this so unique? And, it would take a long time for me to discuss the things that make it unique. But like I was saying, to me, the aspect of self-reflection is something you don't see in many religions. So that the prophets of the Torah are able to look within themselves and see their own faults, and they're able to describe them, and then they're able to challenge people that have those faults. To me, that is supernatural, because people are generally all about self-aggrandizement.
Interesting.
You would never, if Abraham was writing his own account, he would say, you know, I'm the smartest, I'm the most beautiful, I'm the most knowledgeable. He would never say, you know, I'm nobody, God, why are you talking to me? I think Moses did that. Like, and then he said, well, if you say that you're the most humble, then you're not that humble. So then they say that's, you know, so I was part of a free thinker group in college, and you can come up with a list of how ridiculous the Bible is, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. But then we would have to do a counterclaim, and it's like, okay, it's ridiculous because there's things that are very difficult and challenging, but then how much is it out of the ordinary and amazing? So I think it's, you know, like everything, you have to look at the pros and cons. And in Judaism, you have the ability to question and to look at positives and negatives and work within both. In Christianity and other religions is very like one way or the highway. So I think that's where your grandfather was amazed by the Torah, because he did not only have the knowledge of the text, he had the knowledge of the traditions and the understanding of the history of it. So then it was a very vast like knowledge base that he was working with. And the challenge that we have as Jews talking to people who don't have that is that they want to toss it out as meaningless, when to us is meaningful because it has all these layers. And the layers have different ways you can connect to it. But that's a lot to ask for people who don't have that relationship to it as a people or as even individuals.
Yeah, that's a very interesting answer. Oh man, I just lost my train of thought. You know, that's so. I mean, I definitely think you've distilled something to me about. It does definitely feel like in, you know, traditional discourse about religion, a lot of attention goes towards Jesus. Now I know that, yeah, their Christianity is the, I believe, even just by numbers, more popular, so attention's going to go there. But I don't feel like traditionally there is a lot of breaking down the Old Testament as much as there could be. I think it's such an interesting field. Do you think that will ever turn around, that people are going to like move towards that original Torah again to distill more of those lessons?
Well, and that's why we talk a lot about anti-Semitism on my show. It's actually becoming like the #1 topic, because it's just unbelievable the amount of ignorance there is out there about Jews, about their texts, about their understanding of the world and stuff like that. And I took a class, speaking of psychology, I took a class called, biblical psychology? And it's laughable if you look at it from a scientific standpoint, because like there's only one psychology. How can you break it down into biblical psychology? It's like
yeah, that's what I was wondering.
Christian counseling. What is Christian? Is counseling or is Christian? If you have both, then you are watering down the system. And now there's Jewish counseling too. But biblical psychology was interesting because it took all the biblical stories from the Old Testament and used them to analyze people's mental health. So just like I was saying that Freud would use Greek mythology, in this instance we use Jewish stories or Israelite, some people will call them myths or whatever, but it was fascinating that in every story that we read, there was always hope. So if you look at the Greek stories, there's always death, there's always incest, there's always destructive stuff. Maybe there's a little bit of hope, like some guy makes it out. But I think that's why Freud liked it, because they were very real. Like they weren't these fluffy stories. But the Bible has very real stories too. And I remember I wrote my verbatim about suicide, and I used the story of Saul. And King Saul killed himself when he couldn't win a battle, and King David kept on getting more popular. And so he felt some type of despair, and he fell over his own sword. So to me, that story was very true. It was very human, and that's what's amazing about the Old Testament, is that you find these very human stories within this, what some people call like magical book, that has all these other supernatural things in it. And the same thing with the story of Jacob and all these stories. I know one about depression was the life of Jonah. And so if you see how they react to these circumstances, you can actually extract values and ideas to help someone cope with their experience. So I think that if people were open to it, and we have to work with the Christian community because they honor the same text that we do, but they try to some the Old Testament is important because it points to the New Testament. To others, it's too real, it's too violent, it's too old school, and they just want the happy stuff.
Right.
And if the Muslim community had they have some type of respect for the history of the Israelites, but they have their own version. We could all work together to kind of use that as a basis for understanding the world. But everybody has their political or sectarian versions of what happened. So I found it very very insightful. And the thing is, you can only find insight in things that matter to you. So what's happened with the more secularization of the Jewish community is that a lot of these things don't have meaning anymore, and it's hard to incorporate them to the modern life. So one thing that I talk about a lot on my show is that to the modern man, a lot of those stories seem outrageous or are meaningless because they're not even capable of putting themselves in that type of mentality of that ancient world. But in the Muslim community, you see that sometimes they're almost like still in that mindset. So for Jews to judge Muslims as backwards or in a different mentality, whatever, they're still thinking in the terms of how do you react to someone committing a crime, and like everything is capital punishment, or the way that women are dressed or men are behave. It's very like biblical in the sense of like it's like an old Middle Eastern traditional culture that to us it seems so foreign, it's almost alien. So we would have to kind of be more culturalized to be able to even understand some of the concepts.
Oh my gosh, David, I've said to almost every guest, just because I'm naturally like a curious person, that I'd love to have them on again and talk forever. But again, this is true because you've every single time you've answered, I like get 3 more questions. But you know what I think will be an interesting question to sort of tie things in, because I'm curious your take on this. Why do you think there are less Jewish conspiracy theorists than Christian ones?
So the actual people that come up with conspiracies, there's fewer Jews that have them?
I believe so. I believe, at least, I feel like I've seen a lot of, and maybe it's the Trump thing. Maybe it's the fact that QAnon is a very Trump-based thing. Of course, there are communities of Jews, Orthodox communities specifically I'm thinking of, that support Donald Trump. But I believe in general, conspiracy theories, from what I've seen, are more popular and Christian sects than Jewish ones.
Well, people are going to get offended, but we another show that we're going to broadcast on our side of the program is that there's this idea of the education level. So when we were talking, I brought in a rabbi who was talking. We were talking about all the turmoil that's going on and how Jews are being blamed for it. And we were talking about different communities who have been able to thrive in the U.S. They thrive because they have a more ancient tradition that leads them to be able to use the resources in the most successful ways. So Jews, when they came to America, most of them were dirt poor, but they were literate. So if you come from Russia, from a small town in Russia, and Hebrew, and you know a little bit of Hebrew, and Russian or some dialect from over there, you can pick up English, you can study math, you can study science, and slowly, next thing you know, you become an accountant or something, and you're able to pass that on to the next generation. So the ability of being literate, even in medieval times, allowed Jews to be able to survive. People say, how did they survive when everybody was killing them, everybody was tossing them out, because they had a very vast network where they all spoke Hebrew to each other, and they could have merchants and all that. So right now, the people that come up with the most conspiracies are the people that are the less educated.
That is a controversial opinion.
But what's interesting is that this guy was saying yesterday, when I was looking up some stuff, he was saying, the more educated you become, the more stupid you are. So even that idea that scientists or people who are experts on their field don't know what the heck they're talking about, that is an ignorant person's perspective. That now all the people that we trust with our lives, like if you cut your arm, you don't go to a shaman and you ask them to fix it, because the shaman doesn't know anything about blood and about infections and stuff like that. You go to a doctor. Well, now the magical thinking has gotten so strong in our culture that doctors are a bunch of liars.
Right.
Because so-and-so had a bad experience with a doctor. So it's not that the Jews are less easy to fall into these traps, is that we have a more holistic education, because like in the Spanish times, they would teach them science, technology, Torah, and everything, just like in the Muslim community. So you don't hear from people who have this well-rounded education all these fears being actualized in conspiracies. You usually hear from people who either are uneducated or are willfully ignorant. And to me, that's more dangerous, when you purposely don't want to hear facts and build up your own reality.
Wow. Well, look, this has been very interesting. David Daniel Gonzalez, the host of Mystic-Skeptic Radio Show, podcast asking the tough questions. You can find out at, well, I'm going to link everything. I mean, I'm going to link your YouTube channel, your podcast available on all the platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts. And, I might have to pick this up. I was curious about this. Your book, the demonology of ancient Israel, the truth about demons, possession, and exorcism. I know it came out about 2 years ago, but that looks fascinating too.
Well, I don't know if you're available, we can do a short thing about that, because I've been trying to lately push the book, because I think it's an important topic. Everybody, so when you start talking about paranormal stuff, it's very easy to fall into traps there. I can solve a lot of issues with demonology and fear of possession and stuff like that if you just study the history of where it came from.
Wow. Now we could do probably a whole nother episode on that. Let's definitely do it. Yeah, I will put a link to that book. David, so interesting. Thank you so much for coming on to Open Loops. I hope to have you back again.
Thanks, man. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. Take care.